First, an email from Bree in Pennsylvania. Do shorebirds ever get full? Who wants to answer that question? Stan?
I can answer that. They eat voraciously for several weeks before they start their long migration, and I don't think they can get full because they're just eating as fast as they possibly can, and they pile on all the fat that they can, and that's the fuel for their migration.
Terrific. Keep those questions coming. We have a caller from Texas. Go ahead, caller. We're working on that. So now we will go to Olivia with an email in Galveston Island, Texas from Satori Elementary School. If the birds can't stop at their normal stopping places for some reason, where do they stop or what do they do? Great question. Who's going to take that one?
Shorebirds have a variety of areas where they stop and rest and refuel. Some of the key staging areas like Copper River Delta and some of the San Francisco Bay down in San Francisco are the most obvious and places they stop. But there's also a lot of other small little habitats where they can stop on the way up. And it's these small, tiny wetlands throughout the flyway that are so important.
Thanks. We have another email, and this one is directly for Marianne Bishop, and the question is, why do you tag birds?
Oh, there's so much we can learn when we tag birds. I mean, the whole reason we know about the flyways now is from marking waterfowl. And so with shorebirds, there's so many things we can learn, like where they migrate. If you mark a bird, you can tell, okay, it's stopping this area or that area. You can tell how long it lives. For example, the longest lived western sandpiper that we know about is 9 years old. And so if you mark, I have here some bands that we use. These little green ones here have what's called flags. And so by a bird's flag, you can tell what country it was marked at. So green is the color used for the United States. White is the color that's used for Canada. And then some countries even have two flags to denote what country the bird was marked. If you use these smaller bands here in a combination, you can actually tell what bird it is. And so you can study its behavior, if it was successful breeding. We've used radios in the past, and I have a radio here. Stan, maybe you can show them that. We've put those on western sandpipers in as far south as Sinaloa, Mexico, and then heard those birds at places in California, Grays Harbor, Washington, and up here on the Copper River Delta. And it's from using these radios that we know that the birds stop here from anywhere less than 24 hours to 6 days, but the average bird stays here about 2 days. So we do have here today 2 western sandpipers we've caught, and Audrey was going to band one and show you the aluminum band. In this, every bird gets its own individual band, and from that, if we caught this bird again, we would know that he was caught here today at Hartney Bay. And interestingly, 2 years ago, we caught a bird 1 year, and we caught that exact same bird the second year. Wow. And which was pretty amazing. And so it appears then that at least he liked where he was going on the Delta, because he came back to almost the exact same place the following year.
Terrific. It sure is amazing how far these birds fly, and these are some of the ways that scientists are researching them. We're going to try that call again from Galveston, Texas.
Do the male and female birds fly together or separately in their own groups?
The question is, do the male and female birds fly together, or are they separate in their own groups? And that's a very good question. I think probably by the time the flocks get up here, most of them are mixed. They have both males and females, but there are some differences in the timing, and the males tend to migrate earlier than the females do, because they want to reach the breeding grounds first and set up territories, and then they're ready when the females meet them on the tundra. That's an excellent question.
Terrific. Now we have another email, and this is from Dakota in California, it's California Middle School, and this is in Pennsylvania. The question is, how do shorebirds see the insects deep in the mud?
Audrey, do you want to answer that?
Well, actually, most of these shorebirds, the western sandpipers we're looking at here, don't actually see the insects that they're eating. If you can see the end of this bird's bill right there, he has kind of a little bulb at the end of his bill, and that is full of sensors, nerve endings, that allow him to probe down in the mud and feel the insects and the little worms and things that he's eating. So they actually feed by touch more than they do by sight. There are other shorebirds, specifically plovers, that feed more by sight, and they will kind of walk around on the mud flat and look for something and then peck at it. And so they have different behavior out on the mud flats, and you can tell them apart oftentimes by watching that behavior.
We also see birds that will cock their ear, and you can tell that they're listening to what's going on under the mud, and maybe there's a polychaete moving in its burrow or something, and then they'll know to probe there.
Right. We have another question from Ralphie in New York City. When do the shorebirds find time to sleep?
Marianne?
Oh, I think they love those rising tides. That's when they stop and rest. This morning there was a big group out there. I especially see the big flocks in the morning, though. They do tend to sleep overnight. Also feed during the night, though, too. But some will stop and sleep at night.
Great. Now we're going to a phone call from Mount Eccles Elementary right here in Cordova, Alaska. Go ahead, caller.
How do the shorebirds tell freshwater from saltwater?
The question is, how do shorebirds tell freshwater from saltwater?
I guess it tastes different. Most of the shorebirds we're seeing here on the mudflats spend all their migration on saltwater coastlines, and they're really not drinking the salt water, though. They probe around in it, they get their food in it, but you'll often see them flying to nearby freshwater areas to get a drink, so they do know the difference.
Thank you. Now we have an email question from Leanne in Mrs. Johnson's 5th grade class. I hope I have that right. In Teutonia Elementary School in Idaho. And one of the questions is, when shorebirds nest, how do they protect themselves from predators?
Sure. Well, shorebirds are very well camouflaged. In fact, if you're walking along the tundra quite often and you can see and you're looking for their nest, quite often you can walk right past them and not see them. Their eggs are very well camouflaged. And then the shorebirds, if you look at the back and a lot of the coloration on it, it matches a lot of the habitat around it. So that's how they avoid the predators.
They also use a distraction display, it's called, and if a predator does see the bird, the adult will get off the nest and pretend it has a broken wing and lead the predator away from its nest.
Also, the most amazing part about shorebirds, I think, is when you see them out here in the mudflats, and you might have seen some here today. They're in these huge flocks, and it almost looks like a tornado, a lot of sticks in a tornado, just kind of moving around. They're moving back and forth, and a lot of that is predator avoidance. They have a lot of avian predators or hawks. And they'll come in, and when they see all those birds like that, it's sort of the masses like what fish do, and it's very hard to pick out one individual in that. So it's a very good technique for avoiding predators.
Thank you, Dan. Now we're going to take a question here.
I know that the shorebirds are young, but how old exactly are they when they leave their nest and start heading south?
How old are they when they
Leave the nest.
They can get up and run around within a few hours of being born, and they probably can fly within 10 days or 2 weeks of hatching, and they may be leaving and heading south within 6 weeks of being born. So it's all a very quick cycle.
Thanks for that question right here. We have an emailed question from Lisa in Brooklyn, New York. Other than shorebirds, what other birds migrate?
Oh, many birds. Passerines, that is, the songbirds migrate, waterfowl migrate. Almost all of the birds that you find in North America will migrate south for the wintertime. And a lot of that has to do with food availability. There are some birds that spend the winter here. A place like Fairbanks might have 12 species in the wintertime. So most of the birds up in Alaska, Canada, and the northern parts of North America do migrate in order so that they have better food supplies during the winter.
Great. Let's go to another email question. We have one from, again, Mount Eccles Elementary School in Cordova, Alaska, about how many shorebirds die during migration.
Migration's pretty hazardous. There are a lot of threats along the way. Just here around the mudflats in Cordova, we have probably 4 or 5 different species of hawks and things that are trying to eat shorebirds. I don't know that we can say exactly how many die, but particularly in the fall when young birds are headed south, it's probably a sizable percentage of them that don't make the trip all the way to their wintering grounds.
Now we have a call from Satori, Texas. Go ahead, caller.
Do the male and female birds eat the same food, or do the females eat different food?
Question is whether male and female birds eat the same things or whether they eat different foods, and that's also an excellent question. And fortunately, we do know something about that. In a western sandpiper like Audrey has here in her hand, they do eat the same species of prey, and out here at Hartney Bay it's mostly these Makoma clams. But one thing we do know is that they take different sizes of prey, and this may surprise the students, but the females are bigger than the males, and so they take slightly bigger clams than the males do. And these clams are about the size of the nail on your little finger, and the females, though, take just a little bit bigger size than the males do.
I'll take the microphone, and we're going to have a question right over here from one of the students at Cordova Junior Senior High School. Go ahead.
When shorebirds migrate back down south, do they stop here again?
Do they stop here again at the Copper River Delta?
They'll stop a lot on the return, but they don't stop in the big numbers you see in spring. When they move north, they're moving a much bigger time, and a lot of times when they're up in the nesting grounds, the adults will migrate before the young do, so they come down in a little bit slower increments, so we'll see much smaller flocks down here on the way back in fall.
Great, now we're going to another email question. This is from Alex in Brooklyn, New York. How many babies do shorebirds have at one time?
These are all great questions, and most all shorebirds lay 4 eggs, and if they're lucky they will rear all 4 of those young to a size that's big enough to fly south. So the answer is 4. Typically, there are exceptions to that, but 4 is the usual number.
Thank you. Val in Brooklyn, New York has a question, and it is, what is the lifespan of these birds?
It depends on the bird, and it depends on recapturing the bird too. And so the longest, as I mentioned earlier, the longest known western sandpiper was 9 years old. They had a bristle-thighed curlew that was 23 years old. Now that's a bigger bird. So it really depends on the bird, and it depends how much it's been banded for us to really have the length of the maximum length. But I'd say the typical bird, shorebird, a small shorebird, is probably about 5 or 6 years old.
And Marianne, would you agree that the bigger the bird, the longer they tend to live?
Absolutely.
Now we'll go to another email. This is from David in Petersburg, Alaska. Do shorebirds sometimes lose their way?
They sure do, and that's something that's fun for bird watchers because they're always looking for something that's out of place. And where we see it especially is young birds in the fall when they're heading south for the first time. This may surprise you, but the young shorebirds make their way south without their parents. They do it all by themselves, and so it's no surprise that sometimes they lose their way and they end up in the oddest places, and maybe there's a storm that blows them off course, and that really can put a bird in a very, very strange place.
Now we have a question for the governor. Governor Palin, how does Alaska preserve wetlands?
That's a great question. What we do, we have a couple of overseeing agencies like Department of Natural Resources and our Fish and Game divisions also, where we're making sure that the decisions are made when people want to come in and develop along the coastline or anywhere else in Alaska, that these overseeing agencies are making sure that there aren't adverse impacts on the environment, on the habitat, on the animals, on the birds, on the people who live here. We have these agencies to make sure that good decisions are being made so that we can keep it clean and we can keep these birds coming.
Thank you, Governor Palin. Now we'll go to another question right here. Do you have a question for us?
Yes, ma'am. Why do they migrate big packs north instead of south?
Question was why they migrate in big groups rather than small groups. The answer Dan gave before about predators is part of the answer. They like these big flocks because they find it easier to avoid predators. If you're a peregrine falcon and you're diving on a flock of 1,000 birds, sometimes it's hard to pick just one out to go after. And often what a predator will try and do is isolate a bird. They'll try and break up a flock and get one by itself, and then they go after it that way. So there's strength and safety in numbers, and that's why they fly in big flocks.
Okay, we have an emailed question from Joanna in Dumfries, Virginia. What are some predators to shorebirds and how do they protect themselves? Did we?
We kind of answered that. We've mentioned birds of prey like peregrines and harriers, which we see back and forth flying over the mudflats here. Up on their nesting grounds, though, there are foxes. There are gulls, like glaucous-winged gulls out on the tundra. There are jaegers. Even, believe it or not, caribou will eat shorebird eggs when they stumble across a nest on the tundra, and they like to get that calcium in their diet. And so lots of things actually are predators on shorebirds, and it's kind of surprising.
Thank you. Now Lewis wants to know, how is a glacial river like the Copper River different, and how does it affect the birds' wetlands? How is the Copper River different from other wetlands?
One of the things that makes the Copper River different is the amount of sediment that's in it. It's about 2.4 billion pounds a year of sediment that comes down that. So in that, when it brings down all this sediment, what it does is deposit all this wonderful mud and glacial silt out here on the mudflats. And doing it, that's really good habitat for a lot of the polychaete worms and the Malcoma clams. So the shorebirds benefit from that Copper River and that Copper River mud, which creates the Copper River Delta.
Thank you. How about another question over here?
I didn't have another question.
Do you have one?
They have all the answers.
I thought I had one.
Okay, we've talked about the lifespan of birds. How many shorebirds, we got that one already. Do shorebirds see color?
Good question.
Well, you may have to ask one of them to be sure, but I think the answer is that birds do see color, and that's one of the reasons birds are so colorful. And you'll see in songbirds, for example, that they have very, very bright colors, and that these figure into their courtship displays, or in some cases into scaring away predators. And so the sandpipers probably do see color, and this is very different than most mammals, for example, which probably don't see color or only in very muted ways. So we think they probably do.
Now we have an emailed question from Joe in Pennsylvania. What would happen if a bird broke its leg? would the other ones just keep on going or would they wait?
They'd keep on going. And yes, they don't gather around an injured bird. And lots of times you'll see birds with broken legs that keep flying, keep going. We have seen birds, they can survive with a broken leg.
We do see in birds like cranes that if one bird is injured or killed, perhaps its partner will remain in the area for a while, but eventually, life has to go on, and certainly in the sandpipers, they can't afford to wait. They've got a schedule to keep, and they will keep moving north.
Shorebirds are tough critters. Now we have an email from Jose at Barbara Bush Elementary School in Texas. How do all these birds migrating to these different areas affect the people who live in nearby towns or communities and where the wetlands are, where they rest?
Well, the way it affects us here in Cordova is we get this wonderful opportunity to come out here and look at birds every spring. And that's kind of our sign of having made it through a long winter, is when we get to come back out here, see all the birds, see them nesting. It's also an area where a lot of other people from other towns like to come here. In fact, last weekend, if you guys remember, we had probably 200 people here from Anchorage that all came down to look at these birds and stay in town, and we visited with them. So it affects us very positively.
Shorebirds bring people together. Here is an email from Aaron in Brooklyn, New York. How fast do shorebirds fly? Great one.
Well, shorebirds are really fast, and they've got these long pointed wings. I don't know, Audrey, whether we don't want to, there you can get some idea of how long and pointed that wing is. That means they're a fast flyer, and some shorebirds can probably zip along at even up to 60 miles an hour if they need to, but as a routine when they're migrating, it's probably more like 30, 35 miles an hour, something like that, and that's a pace they can go for hours and hours.
We have time for one more quick question. This is from Robert in California, Pennsylvania. Do the birds run into any danger on their migration? Just a real quick answer for that one.
Sure, there's storms, there's predators, there's not getting far enough to where there's good habitat. So sure, there's many different things that
Great.
could